So I guess we'll start off quick round of introductions. Hopefully attendees have looked at the bios here, but I guess maybe Dan, tell us something about yourself that's not on your bio and why folks should listen.
Geez, that's not on my bio. That's about it, really. You know, that's me in 30 words. No, hey, pleased to be here, Jason, and nice to see you again, Travis. I'm Dan Barahona. I'm one of the co-founders of APIsec University. So if you're interested in learning about APIs and how to secure them, we created this site about a year ago. It's really, blown us away at how popular it's been. Clearly, there's a need for some knowledge, some training, some education. So it's non-vendor. There's no product pushes or anything like that. It's all free. So I recommend folks to check it out. But I've been in cybersecurity for 20 plus years, lots of different vendors along the way, and the last few years here in the API space. So it's like to be part of it. Started my career in a different form of security. I worked at General Motors as a safety and crash engineer. I used to design airbags and crash systems and things like that. And that's what got me onto my security journey.
Nice. And we got Isabel back. Yay. Can we hear you now? All right.
Sorry, my provider has decided to restart my connection.
That's okay. While we're waiting on you, I said I'm impressed that we've got at least one of our transatlantic connections working here. So Isabel from you're Barcelona right now, right?
Madrid.
Madrid. Oh, okay. All right. Well, okay. I was close. I was in the right country. Anyways, Isabel, tell us something about yourself that folks may have not already read on the bio and maybe why they should listen.
Absolutely. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Isabelle Mauny. I'm the field CTO at 42Crunch, which is an API security company, as you could imagine. Been working in this, the company is like 5 years old now, and most of my career I spent mostly on integration more than security. So I'm new to the security world, but I'm really enjoying it. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Our pleasure. And Travis, I saved the best for last, so you got to really wow us here.
I don't know about that. And I also don't know what's on my bio. So I'll just tell everyone that my name is Travis Spencer, CEO of Curity. Really happy to be here. I've been working exclusively in digital identity since 2008. And I caught the bug with digital identity when I was working in online banking. And my project actually got shut down, and I said to my boss, like, I'm only ever going to work in security for the rest of my life. So I'm either going to quit or you're going to find me another job in the company. And they moved me into the security operations group, which was great because I've been building stuff, but then I got to like run stuff, and that gave me a great kind of perspective on things. And then in 2010, I moved to Europe. I'm from Portland, Oregon originally, and then started working for a couple of years for Ping Identity. And then after that, did systems integration of the first company I started. And then we pivoted that into Curity, where I'm working now and heading up. And what we're doing is we're providing like a fusion together of API security and digital identity to help understand who's at the other end of the wire of these APIs. So to help people understand more about APIs, we also started a vendor neutral website called NordicAPIs.com, and that has a lot of ebooks and blog posts and videos and things to tell about the other parts of APIs, because there's so much to it and we only focus on security. We've had Jason over giving talks there at the conferences, because we do one in Stockholm and then we also do one in Austin every year, now that we can again, thankfully. So that's me, just working on digital identity and really helping to help organizations protect their data online.
Yeah, for folks that might listen to this later or even today, definitely between APIsec University and Nordic APIs, just a wealth of resources here. And I'm unashamed, unabashed to say that Nordic APIs conference is always my favorite. I'm just going to make my plug again, Travis. It sucks in October. There's not enough daylight. I can't adjust. Summertime in Sweden is beautiful.
Yeah, it is. It is. I was telling Bailey before coming on, I'm at a little island off the west coast of Sweden right now, and it's going to be really hard not to like look out the window here and to stay focused on the webcam, because it is a beautiful summer day here.
That's right. If you put it in the summer, I'll just whine about how there's too much sun. It's, that's the woes of being a conference organizer. All right, guys, on to API security topic of the day. I guess, first off is like, when I look across the space, especially in the last year or two, it's pretty obvious that you guys aren't doing your jobs. No, I'm just kidding. It's pretty obvious that something's broken. And I guess, for folks who are listening, trying to think about how they sort of strategize within their organizations, what is it that you think isn't working? And I say this because, APIs is an attack vector, the top thing now, and it's working like crazy, right? Like breaches are just off the charts now. So I guess kind of going around the circle here, and I'll go backwards this time. Travis, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think that organizations need to understand who is accessing an API at every level. And we talk a lot about zero trust in the media and things, but really it is about, determining at each point along the access path, like who is it that's trying to consume this resource or work with this service, and assuming that every caller is malicious, and having a single place that issues tokens that represent those users, whether they're humans or machines or whatever, so that can be verified by chaining that up to a trusted key that single issuer has. I think if people did just those two things, taking digital identity and APIs together, fusing them, using open standards to do zero trust, I think we'd be in a much, much better place.
And I'm going to tack on here the thing that I think you're saying implicitly, and I think that folks in the security world all know and many others don't seem to grasp, is that your number one problem is the employees in the company, not because they're acting with ill malice, but because they're susceptible to it if you don't put systems in place that stop things from happening. That's why phishing works so well, right?
Right.
Dan, what's your take?
I think my take is recognizing that APIs are a whole new kind of threat, and thinking that we can use the old ways of protecting against them, that will keep us safe, right? And it's remarkable to see these breaches come out week after week and day after day, and well documented. And yet, talking to a lot of security teams, they're looking at kind of good old-fashioned security technologies or methodologies and things like that, and not recognizing that this is a whole new challenge. It's a whole new threat vector that requires a different set of approaches. And maybe boil that down a little bit further, maybe one symptom of this is the over-reliance on our UIs to be security enforcers. Definitely violates kind of an engineering separation of church and state principle, right? The UI is a presentation layer, but if you look at how these breaches happen, they couldn't have happened if the attacker was using the UI, right? Like they couldn't have changed that parameter or have, issued a call that the backend wasn't expecting. But when you go straight to the API and take the UI out of the equation, it's a whole different exposure. And I don't think that security teams are quite savvy enough to that, right? And recognizing that their APIs, while they allow or create so much value and useful integrations and application scalability and all that stuff, those APIs are exposing all the warts and vulnerabilities and everything else, and those are just waiting to be discovered and exploited. So it's a different vector. You can't throw our old web scanners and point them at our APIs and suddenly we're safe, right? It's not going to find the vulnerabilities that the bad guys are looking for.
Yeah, I always mention when folks talk about API first is like treat the API as the product first. And I think commercially folks understand why it's viable, but I think you make a great point too, that like the API should stand on its own. It shouldn't need anything else to operate, and everything else should be able to work off the back of it. So couldn't agree more. Isabel, what's your take?
Well, if I listen to what the three of you said, the key word that comes back here is trust, right? So we don't want to trust. And back to your point, at anything I tell always my customers, whatever data comes your way, should it be a token, should it be some data, whatever comes your way, you must not trust it. Should it come from an application your buddy that sits next to you wrote, or it's an API that has been created for the outside world and can be, consumed by anybody pretty much that has a valid credential, right? And this trust and this basically looking at APIs of like, okay, well, I have those APIs, it's only mine, they're in my environment, nobody knows about them. And that's also a big, misconception, which is as soon as something is opened on the internet, it is public. It is not because you're actually, not putting this into a developer portal and advertising them as something anybody can consume, that it doesn't make them, that it makes them private. There are still, an open endpoint. And if you want to try, just put something there, wait for some calls to come. And 5 minutes later, for sure, you will have plenty of bots attacking that endpoint because that's just the way it is. It's very easy to do, right? So first of all, consider all APIs as being problematic, maybe with some ranges, because then comes the risk. Of course, that's very important. But that is really a key thing, right? Is like, consider this as a problem. And talking to, a lot of our customers, I would say the other problem is the scale, because when I used to work in integration, people that had 5, 10 APIs maybe, and now every time I talk to people, that number seems to explode to be, hundreds and thousands. Sorry, to be hundreds and thousands instead of being just a few. So applying security rules and security principles to that across thousands requires, a different approach. And, this is one of the topics we're going to talk about now, probably.
Yeah, so many great stories. I mean, last week we had a little chat prepping for this, and Dan mentioned what's the exercise bike thing that you had mentioned? Dan?
Peloton.
Peloton. I always forget the name of the thing. I have one of the stupid things too. That it was like relying on front end stuff to do these things. And I think what you're saying is related to what Isabel's saying with if it's external, it's public. And I always like to remind folks that like that little Chrome network tab is real easy. You can see exactly what's happening. This isn't like, dark secret hacker stuff, right? You can just go in that little tab and see how it works. And then you can pop over, to curl or Postman or whatever you want to use and go try it and start throwing things at it. So yeah, if it's external, it's public. It's this is like an old thing, right? We talked about this like 10 years ago and it's still happening. Come on, people, get it. So I think scratching a little level deeper on kind of, what's broken here. I know as kind of, vendors and to some extent consultants here, as y'all are looking at security teams and how they're operating, and then I think we're all saying that there's application development factors that should be involved here. Like it feels like there's a disconnect here. So kind of what's your perspective on, how this isn't working, Dan?
Yeah, couldn't agree more with the premise of the question. There is an app development angle here. I was talking to a guy starting out his security career. He's at a bank, and he's been assigned to go tackle this API security initiative. And he wanted any kind of advice that I could provide him. And first thing I said was, go get to know the application developers, like go know them, right? Way too often security teams and app teams are siloed. They don't talk to each other. You'll hear things from security teams like, we don't even know what APIs we got, right? If you were to go ask the product teams, the engineering teams, the developers, do you know what APIs you have? They're like, yeah, Joe's got this and Sally's got that. And, they have knowledge. They know what these APIs are doing. And more importantly, if you, as the security team, do find issues that they're unaware of, that, there are vulnerabilities, logic flaws, identity issues, authorization, where are you going to fix that? Right? You're not going to bolt that on in a firewall rule or something like that. You got to go talk to the developers, right? If there's a logic flaw in your API, it's got to get fixed in the application logic, right? And so there is a huge gap. And the projects that we work on that are most successful It's where, that kickoff meeting we have isn't just a team full of security engineers. There are API developers, product owners, folks that actually are responsible for creating and operating these APIs. And so this whole notion of shift left isn't just like a, security concept. It's got to be a whole organization concept, right? Not just like, implementing security tools into the application development cycle, but involving the app teams and the developers and the operators in the process itself. Because I think, APIs by their very nature are shifting left, right? It's exposing the internals of our logic and the application functionality, and security's got to get woven in, right? It's why, we've sort of created APIsec University to kind of help developers as much as security teams understand the risks of APIs, what are the best practices. And what's been interesting is we've had a lot of security teams come to us and ask if they can deploy our courses internally, right? They want to put them in their own LMS and things like that. And the people they want to assign them to are developers, right? They want the developers to understand, what kind of risks, what kind of exposures, what kind of vulnerabilities APIs can create, so they can be aware of those as they're creating the APIs, live, right? How they can actually prevent those vulnerabilities from creeping into the code from the get-go.
Isabel, I know your kind of approach at 42 Crunch is a little more like, very like shift left oriented and kind of, tackling these things at design time and that sort of stuff. Do you have any sort of, more specific, approaches to how to solve this?
Sure. So I totally agree. I think, if anyone here thinks that they can fix all these API security problems without ever talking to the developers, simply unfortunately, it's not going to happen, or evil them, because it's, again, we're back to scale, right? And most of the companies we're talking to, you have maybe 2 or 3 AppSec people for 100 developers. There is no way those people are going to be able to do all this work at scale across all those APIs, which are maybe changing 3 times a day, because that's the world we're actually living in, right? But so the scale and getting the knowledge of the developers very early and giving them that feedback very early. I think one of the premises of what we do is to say, okay, let's make sure those potential issues don't creep all the way to inside the life cycle of the API until maybe we get in 6 months down the line on doing some pen testing, let's say, that discovers that problem, right? If we wait all that time, first of all, it's going to be extremely difficult to fix that problem. It's going to be much more expensive. We all know that, the further down the line you discover a problem, whatever the problem is, the more costly it is in time and resources to actually fix it, right? So our premise is to say, okay, starting from design time, for anybody here listening was doing API design first, so they start from defining the interface of their APIs. Right there, right now, we can already tell them, hey, you're using this type of security, right? And based on that, these are the risks that are assigned to it, right? Are you aware of those risks? And it's back to education again, right? In not, I would say put in place a culture in which we help the developers become better at security, as opposed to just, what we see a lot, which is kind of pointing fingers and say, hey, you've introduced a problem. Like, no developer wants to introduce a security problem, but if you're not helping them, discovering them, then that's not going to, you're not helping them. So it is very important, as I think as vendors also in the community, that we have those tools that help the developers very early, test their APIs, analyze them, find those issues, learn from them, so that we can eliminate as much of those problems before, again, the API progresses and even is getting written and deployed in QA, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really our goal. And actually, this is something we've been pursuing since the beginning also of the company. So there's APIsec University. We have something called APIsecure.io. It's a newsletter we've had for a very long time, more than 4 years now. And it's the same principle of helping and educating people about the problems so that they understand, that this is a problem and this is all the help you can get in addressing them, right? So that's really it.
Yeah, sorry I didn't plug that earlier. That was an obvious one. We've also got from Stoplight an OWASP API top 10 style guide that you can run on things, which I think is a very similar kind of philosophical approach to what 42 Crunch is doing, is like, let's find the stuff at the time that it's a spec and you haven't even developed anything, which I think if there was ever a reason to do design first, this might be the biggest one. But I think within that, we're looking at most specifically, how is your sort of auth configured and set up? And I think, Travis, what my experience has been both with, being a practitioner at different companies and talking to folks, as like, it seems like the identity systems are always kind of a shit show, and like, there's 12 different ways to do it and the developers don't know which is the right one and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, besides telling us that you can solve it all with your solution, like, what's your kind of advice on how folks should be thinking about, fixing that aspect? Because I think we all nod our heads that, like, if we could get that part right, so much of the rest is better.
Yeah, definitely. And I would recommend, as a best practice, like, your audience, when it comes to API security, should of course be doing OAuth. But the problem with OAuth is, like, I mean, it's a framework. There's all these specifications that build on top of it. It's like, War and Peace printed 10 times over. I mean, it's huge. So the thing I would say to your audience, as far as best practices go in the auth space, is use the FAPI profile of OAuth unless you have a specific reason not to. So FAPI originally stood for financial grade API, and that sort of morphed into financial grade API, and now it just means FAPI. But if you look for it, you'll find it, and it turns a bunch of the maze and recommended and optional things in OAuth into musts and requirements. And what's great also about FAPI is that it's actually formally proven to be safe and secure. So a very in-depth analysis was done of that, and saying, with these kind of assumptions, this is safe. And so, even non-banking, non-financial services organizations should be looking at this. Large scale aerospace definitely should be doing FAPI. Technology companies, big SaaS companies, all APIs should be following the FAPI profile of OAuth. If companies just did that one thing, the newspaper headlines would change dramatically.
So I have a feeling that some folks listening hear you say OAuth and they're like, yeah, I know about all that stuff. If I need to connect my platform with some other platform and provide a consent flow for my users, but what about like just my internal service development? I don't need to do any of that stuff, right?
I would do it even for that, because like we said a few minutes ago, I mean, assume every API is going to eventually become public. Treat every API like it's going to be a product, and trust is central in that. So, not relying on the thing that's calling it, because that could change as it goes through the life cycle and maybe ends up being called by other entities than originally invoked by. So I would say that unless you have a good reason and you have like a very clear roadmap of this API, like, assume it's going to be public and then protect it with the FAPI profile of OAuth. And that profile goes way beyond just consent management and third-party integration and things like that. I mean, it's about tokens and knowing who's the other end of that API.
If I may add just one thing to that, I think, like, anything in security, it's all about risk, right? So one of the things that I think we were doing well, maybe in the web app world, is, do kind of threat modeling of our applications very formally. So we knew exactly what the app would do, who would be accessing it, the threats attached to it, et cetera, et cetera. I don't see that many people, if any, doing this for APIs in my customers, again, because of the scale, et cetera. But you need to at least understand, what is this API going to do? What data is it going to manipulate? How is that data going to be manipulated by who? And then you can use that as a framework for defining, hey, okay, so probably 90% of the cases, it's going to be OAuth, right? But I see customers, within the FAPI profiles, etc. There's also the need to use, for example, digital signatures on top of that, just to protect the data as well, and maybe using that as authentication mechanisms based on signatures. But so there's many different ways, right? But until you actually know what you're developing and what is the risk associated to it, it's going to be difficult to choose the right option, right? With brackets around the right option.
Yeah, I would say though, Isabel, that I mean the reason that most people don't do threat modeling is because threat modeling is really hard, and it's a kind of squishy thing to do as well. Like I think you need to be specifically skilled and trained and experienced in it, and it's kind of a rare ability that people have, and that's why I think that going with FAPI as the default is good, because that threat modeling has been done and it's been turned into a formal proof that has been analyzed mathematically and said, like, this is QED, this solved, this is secure, and under these certain assumptions. So, if you want to do something like with HTTP signing, that's in the profile, at least in the newer version of FAPI, you can do that if you need to tie the payload to that. So I really, really think that you need a good reason not to be doing FAPI.
Well, I mean, I think Isabel's pulling on an interesting thread, though. And I mean, our theme here is like, we know there's an education gap. And I'm just going to say plainly that I think this applies to the API space as a whole, right? This came on in a lot of ways really fast to suddenly have all the world's traffic is now APIs, right? And like every company is now doing some kind of API push. There's a talent gap, no question. There's a knowledge gap. So I guess, Isabel, when you think about that threat modeling stuff, are there good pointers that you can give on where folks might go look to kind of see examples of what you're talking about, or like ways to think about it?
Yeah, so there are even, products actually doing this right now, but at the very high level, the good old principles of doing threat modeling still apply. There is not, conceptually we have more, there are different ways of accessing things, but conceptually you still have, risk and threat actors and understanding the whole stack as well of what you're going to use in terms of deploying that API. It's not only about the code itself, it's everything underneath. So you have to evaluate that entire stack to understand your threat scope, right? Are you on Kubernetes on a public cloud, or are you on a VM in your internal system? That's not the same risk either, right? So there's multiple factors. So the good old ways, I think, in principles was still probably working. But if without even going into deep threat modeling, which I agree, even that for application, it's actually complicated to do for the mere mortal, just thinking about what is the data and how are people accessing that data, who's going to access that is already a good starting point, right? This colleague of mine, I used to say that you have this application which is created like internally for a small team, and then suddenly it's being used by 3 teams within the company, and then somebody says, oh, this is great, we could open it to a partner, and then the next thing you know, it's actually opened for anybody to consume. As you go through that journey, the risk is changing, right? So reevaluating, what does it mean to take this little thing that was only used internally to now expose it to the outside world? That's what I'm talking about. It's like, go back to thinking about what does that mean and what are the implications, and not thinking there are no implications, right? I guess that's my high level recommendation here. Stop and think about the consequences, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think you're both, while there's a slight difference of perspective here, no surprise, you got an identity guy and, kind of a security girl. I think you're both saying, though, that like treat the API development as though you're always going to externalize it as early as possible, or at least think that way, because you'll have taken care of a lot of the potential risks that could have manifested much earlier.
And Jason, I maybe sort of pivoting off that conversation. If we look at the OWASP top 10 that's just come out, right? There's a brand new edition for 23. The top 2 of the top 10 haven't changed, right? And the top 2 are basically, excuse me, broken authentication and broken authorization. That's what it is, right? And so I think, to Travis's point, like if you don't have authentication nailed, right, you're gonna have all kinds of exposures. But you're not done, right? Like there's more, and authorization is the very next thing. And it's really interesting. Almost every breach, like, and I highly recommend folks subscribe to APIsecurity.io. It's a fantastic resource. It'll keep you up to date on all the, like, the latest goings on in APIs, the breaches, the best articles. But almost every breach violates one of those top two, right? And it's interesting. So, you'll see breaches like Peloton, where there was an authentication flaw, right? Their API endpoint was open. It had access to all kinds of things. They eventually went and fixed it. And then now you just had to authenticate to the API and then still have access to all the things, right? So the very next issue was an authorization flaw, right? So if you really want to, like, cover, or sort of like the highest ROI I can imagine on API security is to really focus on the authentication and the authorization, right? So who's coming in and what are they doing? What can they do? What should they be able to do? Make sure they can't do things they're not allowed to. And I think it goes back to Isabel's threat modeling, right? Like, what does this API endpoint do? What data does it have access to? Who should be allowed to have access to it? Who shouldn't? And I think, Travis, you're right. It's a difficult skill set, right? And it's probably more of a way of thinking than anything else, right? Because we tend to build endpoints or features of our apps to deliver a piece of functionality, and it does, right? But it's the negative scenarios, the negative testing that you need to be thinking about. Like, well, okay, it delivers the product spec, all right? I need to be able to sell crypto on this endpoint. Great. But how can that endpoint be manipulated, right? How could it be used in ways I never thought of, right? Because that is what the attackers are trying to figure out. Like, how can that API be exploited and leveraged? And, what calls can I send in there that the developer never thought of, right? In fact, like in the Coinbase example, when they blogged about it, which I give them a lot of credit for being so transparent, the root cause was a missing logic check, right? There was no application code that said, do you own this crypto that you're selling? Right? So it's thinking in those ways that will help organizations stay a whole lot safer and find those vulnerabilities before they can cause you any pain.
Yeah, there's definitely an easy pro tip in the midst of this discussion that we're also implicitly saying, which is, auth identity systems, that sort of thing. It's always the long pole in the tent on kind of your overall API platform strategy. And what's scary to me is when you talk to folks that don't realize it's the long pole in the tent. And that's the thing that I see all too commonly is like, oh, well, we're just doing this thing or whatever, it's kind of like whatever we had laying around. And it's like, no, that's the thing that you need to start step one, because it's hard, right? Like everything we're describing is difficult. It's a reason it's not getting done. I think that's kind of my viewpoint a little bit, is it's the hard thing. And folks look and go, well, that's too expensive. We got to get this thing out the door. So let's get past that part and we'll be okay. And then now you're putting out fires all the time. Now you got breaches. Now, all of a sudden all your capacity sucked up because you skipped step one, right? So I always tell folks, if you're just heading down this road, like start with defining that stuff. Start with having kind of a North Star of what you're trying to get to with all of it. And, start simple, but at least start. Don't just, take the crap you have laying around and hope it works, because it probably doesn't in this context. Travis, you had unmuted. I think you were going to add on.
Yeah,
something.
I was just going to add in, as quick as you can, get the whole off piece solved, like we're saying. And the best thing to do, I think, is to just build an identity platform that all your APIs can leverage. So it's sort of, you put that in the done pile. It's like, okay, we follow best practices. We set up FAPI. We got a group there that manages that in the identity and access management group or the security group. And then all of those APIs can just start to consume it and use it. And you're not then having to fight those fires. And to use the expensive, it's too expensive as an excuse. It's like, it's pennies compared to the breaches that you're going to be, the cost of the breaches that you're going to be like suffering from if you don't do these things. And there's so many other things that like low hanging fruit. Just fuzzing. If you would just fuzz your code, as a part of your CIDC pipeline, you'll find those sort of things where it's like that token didn't belong to you. It's like, random stuff, just pumping that into your code, I think is definitely something that is a best practice and is an easy thing to do. And being able to check your dependencies, make sure those don't have vulnerabilities, and scanning those, really, really simple to do. So I think, get the identity piece under control for sure, but then, all of these sort of shift left things that we're talking about, earlier in the process, I think are also essential. And I think, that education gap, if we do those things, we've listed a few resources, getting people trained up in that and getting that mindset. And then, like you were saying, Dan, I think, the security team, embedding them with the app developers so that they can go and sort of create this mindset. I remember at the bank, they'd bring this guy in and he was like just there to terrorize us and fill our minds with all these nightmare scenarios. I mean, send someone by to like rattle the cage of all the developers and say, this is what's going to happen if you don't do this stuff. I think that helps to create that culture like we were talking about. So I think it's definitely doable. And I think that the most important thing is to do more than your competitor, right? Because unfortunately, there is no absolute security. So if you just do more than your competitor, at least the hackers will go and exploit that.
Like a true businessman.
Yeah, I guess so.
So I think everyone kind of poked here over the last comments at kind of testing strategies. So if we're working our way left and starting with security teams who unfortunately all too often are like, trying to catch stuff on the way out the door. If we move up the chain to kind of testing and, whether or not you have QA these days is debatable, but and Travis, you mentioned fuzzing, which I think even beyond security is such a great approach. It's just throw garbage at things and see what happens. It'll manifest all kinds of cool stuff. Are there other kind of testing strategies specific to kind of security that you all would recommend? Let's go, Dan.
Well, geez, I appreciate the alley-oop. It's definitely what we do at APIsec. We're basically a testing company, a testing technology, APIsec.ai, if you want to check it out. And a little tee up for Isabel, I recommend you check out the Q&A. There's someone asking about the 42 crunch testing technology. But what we do is we sort of try to pressure test that API in every possible dimension that we can conceive, right? And it turns out with, if you think about like a classic web and mobile app pen test, you've got a workflow, you've got a structure, you've got a UI that you're working with. You can, things you can point and click and fields you can fill out. With an API, you got a flashing cursor prompt. It is just like, okay, what do you want to do next? And asking your pen tester to sit down and write code to test your API is a big ask. They got to be this unicorn of combination of skills that are very, very hard to find, right? So that's what my company does. We have a technology that will analyze your API. It will throw hundreds of attack vectors and tailor them to your API, and then blanket your API with thousands of unique tailored attack scenarios. And automation is really, I guess, the key word here, right? Like you've got to be able to blanket that API with every possible, Coinbase scenario and Peloton scenario and, you name it, scenario. And then not do it once or twice a year, but on every release, right? And there's the sense like, well, my API doesn't change that much, right? Changes maybe a couple times a year or even every month or what the hell, even every week. But what does change all the time is back-end logic, right? We're constantly pushing new code into production. And that's where the vulnerabilities creep in. It's not the API, it's the functionality that's behind it. And that's what you need to be testing and evaluating. That's what our technology can help you out with. I appreciate the question, Jason.
Sure. Yeah, I got to throw at least one softball to keep coming back. Yeah, and I would just tack on there that, we'll call it a teaser on the next subject if we have time, which is that I think testing is often driven by product managers. So I've been writing and talking quite a bit this year about API as a product. And I think it's always a bit of a like, you get like the RCA dog look from people like, what? When I bring up like automated testing, they're like, but I'm product. It's like your acceptance testing. You need to quickly recognize this is a programmatic interface. thereby it should be the most highly automated testable thing that you've ever managed as a product. So make your acceptance criteria green lights, right? Like, don't settle for less. You can't just go, oh, the engineer said it's good, I'm fine. Like, no, you need hardcore sign off. That's all green tests, right? Anyways, Isabel, I know you're in this kind of space as well. Dan was lobbing you the softball there. So besides your plug, any other any other advice?
Yeah, so that way I can answer the question that was asked as well. So indeed, so very much like if you're using Stoplight and using it to edit your open API files and defining that contract. So everything in our platform is driven in terms of the contract, like defining this is what our API does. That's the data that comes in, data comes out. That's how you call it. And this is really for us as a source of truth that we use across the entire platform, right? But from a testing perspective, what does that mean? That means like at design time. So we use this contract to do this testing at design time in the IDEs. And why in the IDE? So it's as easy as possible for developers to do this testing by themselves. Before they push something in a CI/CD and somebody trusts that it's actually working, we do it from the IDE, okay? So you can download this IDE plugins for free. It's on Eclipse, it's on VS Code, it's on IntelliJ. You can use that, test your stuff. And then, if you want to, and to answer your question, Marcus, if you're using that free plugin, we don't save anything, right? It's all a stateless test. You give us the data, we send you a report, we forget about it, okay? But just to give two maybe key messages, I always tell people is like for every single happy path test that you do, you should have 10 hacky path that you test that you do.
Ooh, that's catchy. I'm stealing that. Travis, you were gonna chime in here.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, in our product, we had 2 years before we had an actual UI. So we sold it just with the API. And then, eventually we added the user interface, and we had thousands of tests. And those tests were interacting with the API, and later on the UI, we were also testing that using Selenium and things like that. And so one of the things that we've done, which I would definitely recommend your audience to copy, is to put a proxy in between. There's this OWASP Zap tool that you can just change and add a proxy, and it will run all those same tests, but with additional data that find issues, find vulnerabilities. And it's such an easy thing to do by just adding that proxy then and seeing where things come in and being able to dynamically generate content and check for issues there. So that's something I think to definitely look into, and being able to sort of reuse all of your tests that you have, both going directly against the API and also for maybe UI tests that you have. Pretty easy technique to get some additional security testing added in.
Well, I guess it's safe to say for folks listening here, if you look at how you're testing APIs and it's all end-to-end tests that are banging against the UX somewhere, probably doing it wrong. I guess, are there, for folks who maybe are in smaller places, startups, early stage, they can't afford your solutions. Are there sort of open source type things that you might point them to where they can, sort of rig these things up themselves and sort of resource folks a little bit?
I would just refer people to the FAPI working group and the OpenID Foundation. I mean, there you'll find a list of alternatives to our product as well. But I think the most important thing is to be using that standard. And I mean, it's you got to find something. You're going to pay either with your time or you're going to pay with your money. And so finding something there that does FAPI, I think, is essential. And there's plenty of choices there. And I think that ours adds a lot on top of the standard and is very affordable, but by hook or by crook, make sure you do that.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. So if we've worked our way from kind of security teams and how kind of the old model of network boundaries or kind of not being involved in app development is a problem. And we're asking these folks who tend to live on the very far right to connect with the very far left of developers starting from scratch project. I tend to believe that product managers are going to be the bridge of the future, like managing that sort of security stakeholder. Do you all have any advice for sort of, the burgeoning role of API product managers here? And whoever's game, jump in.
I'll jump in with the most basic comment, perhaps, which is simply to have API product managers. You talked about APIs as products. They most certainly are, and a few organizations we talk to have a role, right? They are literally API PMs, they're API owners, there's API teams. And I think maybe the first step is to simply recognize that, right? And to organize the team around, or organize a portion of the team around APIs as products, right? And you're right, those API owners and PMs do become the bridge, right? Between security, between the engineering team creating the functionality to deliver and so forth. So I think, the very starting point is to simply, carve out a role, an API center of excellence or whatever you want to call it. And then do things like Travis mentioned, embed security into it. We see a lot of CISO roundtables and things like that and talk about this topic. And the one best practice that seemed to come across a lot, especially from teams that were especially effective, was embedding, like, what I think some of them call them like security champions into the dev organizations, right? So this sort of like matrix thing. So they're security people, but they live inside the dev organization, right? And yes, they're there to freak you out and tell you all the ways that your code can be exploited, but it's a way of integrating that mindset right up front into where the code's being developed. So I think between that and actually, creating roles that own the APIs outright is a pretty good start.
That's funny. The other topic I've been harping on this year is sort of API governance, and really that, like, the modern way of doing this well is a small group of sort of curators of the standards who then recruit sort of the army of decentralized folks to give that power to and the authority. And what's funny is I ended up getting invited to a security track to give the talk, and it didn't even dawn on me at first, but oh yeah, this is the exact same thing, right? That a core group defines how, and I love, Travis, by the way, your description that, like, explain the rules, not in the you do it because I told you so, because that's a guaranteed way to get engineers to do the opposite. But here's what happens if you don't do these things. We're trying to make you look cool. We're trying to protect you. Here's what happens if you don't. But then, having a group of folks who get that, who can tell that story, who live in the same geography or work in the same dev center or whatever, that are a trusted voice, as opposed to someone you've never talked to that suddenly pops in at review time. Yeah, I think this sort of federated, decentralized approach to APIs in general, especially security, is key. Sorry, y'all are supposed to be saying these things, but it ties in, Dan, to what I've been talking about all year. Travis or Isabel, y'all have a take on this kind of, I guess we're teasing at governance here now.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, API is code, right? And it goes through a life cycle. We've been talking about shifting the security to the left of that life cycle, but someone needs to own that code. And I mean, it's natural to have a product manager, regardless of if the API is a component within your product or is a product unto itself. And having those requirements and those responsibilities on the API, I think is important, so that you can advance that and use that and make sure that it's meeting the requirements that you set out to accomplish with that API and the product that it is a part of, or the product itself. So I think that, product management, definitely important, as in any software development.
Yeah, and to your point, Jason, it's really about getting buy-in. I think it's not forcing people onto people. I have a customer who used to say this, otherwise all you get is malicious obedience. People just say, yep, sure, we'll do, and then don't. So it's a cultural reward for, and a cultural blame. So I guess one of the key messages maybe here is, yes, API security is a technical problem, but it's also a cultural problem. You're not going to do DevSecOps if you don't change the way you work. So it's not about tools, it's about the way you work. So start maybe on a small project, put that in place, put a security champion, do it like, a small team where you put people together, learn from that, and go and scale that across your company. A big bang in one go, it's probably going to be complicated, but if you do it this way, you're going to learn on the way, learn to do things differently, maybe, and get the rewards from that, and then get the buy-in also internally from a money perspective and budgets on how to do things, because that's important as well, and then go from there.
Yeah, it's I think yet again, this is one of those true of APIs in general, and really bigger than that. APIs are in some ways an implementation detail of kind of shifting into a being a platform, right? And I think companies that think that you can just sort of bolt on APIs and like magic happens, that's not the magic when you look kind of behind the curtain at places that do this well. There's a big culture change involved, and there's implicit reorganization involved around capabilities instead of systems. There's a lot to unpack here. And I think security is just one of the items on that list of sort of cultural changes. I mean, we started at the top of this saying that security teams being in the habit of reaching out and going and spending time with teams, that is an absolute culture change for a lot of places, as excuse me, where we're used to seeing sort of, no one even knows who the security team is, and they just, some like anonymous comment comes in, you did this wrong, go fix it, right? Like that's a huge culture change in itself, is just, to some extent hiring security folks who like people. Right. Same thing in API governance in general, is like, no, don't hire the people that like beating people over the head. Hire people who are like, I have an innate need to help people do things well. Right. So I guess any other quick tips with 5 minutes on the clock here on kind of culture change as you see it. And I think it's totally fair game to say that we can go above and beyond security.
No, I think you hit on something really important there, Jason. I mean, the platformification that organizations are going through, the digitization of their products and services, inevitably means that they're going to have APIs. And if you're sort of recasting yourself as a digital organization, you can't do so with insecure and unsafe APIs. So this is just like, this needs to become, part of the daily routine. And to actually establish yourself as an insecure platform is never anyone's ambition. So this needs to be, top of mind. And, maybe even that product manager needs to step it up to be something over that, like some sort of enterprise architect, or even something at the C-suite that's in charge of and knowing and responsible for the API security, since it's, forming that platform of the company.
Yeah, maybe one piece of conclusion here is like, security is everyone's problem. I guess that's the way we used to see before. It's like, okay, you have the security guys at the end of the flow. We're throwing them something over the fence. They'll tell you if they're happy with it or not. And then you'll see if it comes back. And that simply, that's it. It doesn't work anymore. So the same way we have included testing as part of a continuous development of our code, we need to include security as a continuous part of our code. All aspects of it. So we talked here about the APIs. Again, look at the stack. It's about the containers you're bringing in. It's about the libraries that you're using. Like everything you're bringing in to make your API run, all of that is something you need to look at in terms of security. And if you don't make like that flow of bringing things in, looking at them, validating them, something that you do as you go, part of the project, part of the cycle of developing stuff. Again, we're back to scale. It's not going to scale. So I don't think there's much of a choice here than bringing this in step by step, but we have to do it.
Yeah, and I think there's not much I can add here, Jason, that these two experts have already talked about. That whole concept of just integrating security into the dev cycle. I mean, that's really what it's all about. And as much as possible, making security something that actually improves the lives of developers. I was talking to one API team, and they went around and created an API marketplace. They wanted to have an inventory and they wanted to have control and all this, but it actually gave developers a way to showcase their work, to find other APIs that have been developed. It actually improved the devs cycle and their experience. So find ways to actually make this a net positive for the development organization and the API owners, and that'll probably benefit security as well.
Yeah, right on. The enablement approach is certainly the way going forward. Well, I just want to say thanks to everyone here for being very, I think, giving and doing your best to be, vendor neutral and giving general advice. But I would definitely encourage listeners, go check out their solutions as well. These folks have been around a while and doing really cool stuff. And I think this really is a group that's kind of on the leading edge. So